All right. Hey, Doug, I appreciate your taking the time to do this interview this morning. I've spent a lot of time researching um, the government involvement in the drug trade, and it seems to have tentacles that expand around the world. From what I can tell, in the United States at least, it seems like the illicit drug trade really got started with Arnold Rothstein back in 1921. Can you tell us a little bit about that time and Rothstein's involvement in the drug trade?
Well, sure. There was a time when opium and narcotic drugs were not illegal. Okay, it was just a free for all, and anybody could buy opium on the street. I'm sure you've all seen the jars of cocaine that were given to kids and stuff like that at the turn of the century to keep them quiet. And, people could go into a drugstore and they could buy morphine over the counter. Uh, and this was pretty much the same around the world. But the United States decided, for a bunch of reasons, starting in the middle of the beginning of the 20th century, to prohibit alcohol and narcotic drugs, and there was this thing called prohibition, where it was actually illegal to import drugs into the United States. I mean, and alcohol. Everybody, I'm sure I hope all your listeners are aware of what prohibition was. I know people are forgetting about history, but there was a time, it was called the Roaring Twenties, when it was actually illegal to have alcohol, and at the same time, narcotic drugs were also made illegal. So this happens in 1915, that drugs based on opium derivatives are made illegal. But the government did not know how to deal with the problem. So it took them a couple of years to create a narcotic division within the Internal Revenue Service, which was there was also a alcohol prohibition unit, and then there was a narcotic drug prohibition unit, and so they got law enforcement powers to prevent people from dealing in narcotics. At the same time, the government took steps to regulate the production and distribution of narcotics. Doctors still needed, hospitals still needed morphine. So how are you going to go about regulating the production of narcotic drugs for use by hospitals and doctors? And so all of that took a long time to organize and figure out how they were going to do it. And they gave the responsibility of regulating the industries that were producing narcotic drugs, and the pharmaceutical companies, and even the pharmacies on the street corner, to this narcotic division. Okay, so now agents were regulating corporations and companies, and as well as going after drug traffickers. And they still didn't really know how to do it. I mean, this was all new to the world, and so there's a lot of fumbling around, and of course it's prohibition, so there's a lot of corruption. But as soon as drugs are made illegal, as soon as alcohol is made illegal, well, the demand for these things doesn't stop. And everybody who, just like the guys were bringing in alcohol from Canada, or boats were unloading boatloads of alcohol on Long Beach in New York, and the mafia was, just distributing it around the country and stuff. The same smuggling routes that were used for alcohol now start being used for drugs coming from countries that still have not made narcotics illegal. Okay, so places that produce and grow opium, like China and Turkey, are just pouring drugs into the United States illegally, and all of a sudden it becomes there's this like big battles that the narcotic agents are having with drug traffickers, shootouts, and stuff like that, and the whole thing is just completely out of control. And the guy who was really at the focus of the illegal aspect of bringing drugs into the country and distributing them around the country was a great Jewish criminal who made his fortune in alcohol and drug distribution within the United States, importing it from Europe and from China. And he became the first focus in an international way of this Bureau of Narcotics that is created within the Prohibition Unit. Okay, and at the same time, people are trying to figure out how to go about stopping this. So one of the major ways they did it was through the State Department and the Treasury Department, trying to get foreign countries in Germany and France to create regulations for chemical companies which were creating heroin and morphine in Europe, because they didn't have the same regulations as the United States. So you had pharmaceutical companies in France that were overproducing heroin, and the overproduction of it was going to purchasers, guys who were purchasing narcotics for Arnold Rothstein. And he had this one network set up where a Peruvian diplomat was bringing 250 pounds of heroin into the country every couple of months. Wow. That was being diverted from producers in France and Germany. Okay, so it took 20 years for the United States to use its influence to get foreign countries to stop diverting and to start regulating their own.
So were the efforts?
So there's just this huge network of drugs coming into the country to begin with, before the United States is able to bring the rest of the world into compliance, or to try to.
Was the clamping down on drugs and alcohol, was there a genuine effort there, or was it always some sort of scheme to limit supply and drive prices up? Or was it actually a genuine effort to curb these things?
It was an impossible task, okay? Plus which, there were some people, some countries that were exempt from narcotic control. And this starts primarily in 1926, when the nationalist government, which is the political party called the Kuomintang, which belongs to a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, who is fighting against different factions in China that were trying to take control of China. And the United States lines up with this guy, Chiang Kai-shek, and the Nationalist Party. And they're fighting communists, and they're fighting other warlords. And all their money, all their revenue is coming from the opium trade. So when the first narcotic agents go overseas to China, and this is around 1924, 25, 26, and they're looking for the people in China who are supplying Arnold Rothstein in the United States. Well, after 1926, all their investigations get shut down, because the guy who's supplying Rothstein is Chiang Kai-shek and his narcotic traffickers. And they need Chiang Kai-shek to fight the communists and these other people, so they can seize control of the United States, can seize control of China from the British and the French and all these other colonial powers that were there. So from the very beginning, even before the CIA exists, the politics and national security trump drug law enforcement. And drug law enforcement is, then they say, well, you guys got to handle the problem here in the United States. The drugs are coming in, sure, but we can sort of track them as they come into the United States. There was a big case in 1929 where the Kuomintang nationalist Chinese ambassador to San Francisco, his wife gets caught bringing in like 2,000 pounds of opium and heroin and everything, and it's a big scandal, and all these drugs are going to the Tongs in San Francisco, which receive the drugs and sell them to the mafia. It's Lucky Luciano's gang, which is receiving this huge amount of drugs from narcotics from the nationalist Chinese. So they arrest the Yaos, the cows. That was the name of the ambassador, and they just send him back. He doesn't do any jail time. Nobody does any jail time, and the whole thing just continues. And this goes on and on throughout the 1930s. There's a big, huge scandal after Arnold Rothstein gets arrested in 1929. He actually gets killed. And there's a big scramble to find all his documents. And the investigation leads back to the fact that the guy who was in charge of this narcotic division in Prohibition Unit, a guy named Levi Nutt, his son-in-law was doing Arnold Rothstein's taxes. Okay, and there's this huge corruption scandal, and they find out that everybody in the Bureau of Narcotics in New York City is on Rothstein's payroll. So they're really naive about how to go about policing themselves, okay, because it's prohibition and everybody wants to drink, and you know, the corruption is just across the board. And meanwhile, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, who was the preeminent Jewish trafficker and crime boss at the time, actually organized nationally crime in the United States. Okay, they bump off, those are the two guys who bump off Rothstein, and they create a Mafia National Commission with, this guy Lansky is the sort of the finance minister. Luciano is like the president, and there's a guy named Frank Costello in New York who's like the prime minister and liaison to the establishment. And they just start making a fortune out of drug and alcohol prohibition. And they start channeling their money into legitimate businesses like Trump. You know, it's mostly casinos and hotels and anything that's related to the entertainment industry and racetracks and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, crime is one of the biggest industries in the United States, and it had never been before. And it's all because of drug and alcohol prohibition. So so prohibition has to come to an end. Okay, but when prohibition comes to an end in 1936, drugs, which are considered an evil, are still outlawed. Okay, and so the mafia and its Jewish branch turn really full time to dealing narcotics to make up for the money that they've lost dealing trafficking and alcohol. So it just becomes a huge, fantastic industry, and there's no law. Law enforcement is incapable of keeping up with it in the 1930s because they're corrupt, and everybody, all the narcotic, all the local police departments, all across the United States. There was one guy told me there wasn't a narcotic deal that went down in Chicago in any precinct that didn't get kicked back to the politicians through the cops. So the cops are basically regulating this mafia organization of gambling, prostitution, and drugs, and everybody's making $1 billion off of it. And of course, there's a demand for gambling, for prostitution, for narcotics. So nobody tries too hard to get rid of it. And it just is this, it just keeps growing and growing and growing. And it just becomes a huge industry in the United States by the time World War II comes around.
So throughout the 30s, this is before you start to see people like Dulles and Angleton of the OSS and CIA come onto the scene. Who were the major players in government at the time who had contacts with the underworld?
Well, certainly the Department of Justice and the Treasury Department, although overseas, the State Department is handling that function. Starting in 1930, after the Nutt Rothstein scandal, find out that the head of the narcotic division is basically on the pad. They appoint a guy named Harry Anslinger to be commissioner of narcotics. And he's the son-in-law of the Treasury Department, the Secretary of Treasury, a fantastically rich guy named Andrew Mellon. Okay, so Anslinger is above corruption. He can't be brought off. He's married into this billionaire family. And he starts trying to conduct overseas investigations to find out the source, and he tries to organize a professional narcotic bureau in the United States. It's really, he's pushing the proverbial against the tide, but they try. And investigations are handled out of Washington by a group that he puts together called a flying squad. And it does national investigations and overseas investigations. And it is composed of Treasury agents, customs agents, IRS agents, some narcotic agents, and they all work together on really preeminent cases. But they also form, a kind of firewall for the State Department so that they can protect traffickers from countries that are being protected by the United States. And especially as World War II starts building up, this becomes preeminent. And there was a narcotic agent named Maurice Hellbrand, who actually wrote a book called Narcotic Agent, a Jewish undercover agent. And here's an example of how it worked. In 1934, he makes a case on two Italian oystermen who were bringing in heroin into New Orleans. Okay. And they surveil them, and they find out that they're working with an airline called TACA, TACA, out of Honduras. Okay. Well, the guy does this investigation, and he finds out that TACA airline is flying heroin from Honduras into the United States and delivering it to the mafia and bringing drugs back to Honduras. And when he reveals this to Anslinger and all the bosses, big bosses at Treasury Department and the State Department, they shut the case down and they shut off all of the investigation of this airline, because it's the United States that's funding a revolution in Honduras. and they're doing it because the Germans are making inroads into Honduras. And the Germans are, the government of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis are trying to ally themselves with these governments in Central America with the idea of someday invading the United States. So wherever the Germans are operating, wherever the Japanese are operating around the world, if the United States has to support drug traffickers, it does so. Okay. And then it tells Anslinger and the narcotics agents in the United States, well, you got to find a way of breaking up the distribution networks here, but the drugs are going to come in. So just do your best. And they really don't care all that much, because they make sure, and they start putting in a system in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, whereby the drugs that come into the United States, and this is like right out of The Godfather, go to a black community and go to disenfranchised minorities in the United States that have no political clout and really can't make a fuss. And all of law enforcement in the United States starts being organized around this principle of allowing a certain amount of drugs into the country and just allowing the mafia and its allies to distribute them within black communities. And that becomes like the solution to this national security problem. And it solves it, they sort of kill two birds at one stone. They keep poor people disenfranchised and poor and in prison, and they start building up a huge prison industry. And at the same time, they're protecting their allies overseas. And then the whole thing explodes in World War II.
So as we move into the 1940s, you have the emergence of the OSS, which, from what I can tell, primarily was involved with psychological warfare activities and some guerrilla warfare activities. But also you had James Angleton, who was connected to the drug smuggling rings at the time. Can you tell us a little bit about Angleton's connection to the drugs and who his international partners were?
Well, there was it's a big coincidence in a sort of way, insofar as Italy has decided to go fascist and align itself with Hitler in Germany. So when the United States and its allies decide to invade Europe, the first place they want to invade is Italy. Okay, but they haven't got a lot of contacts there. Meanwhile, German submarines are like roving up and down the east coast of the United States, and everybody's afraid of the Japanese attacking the west coast. And so in order to bolster defenses of the ports along the east coast and in the Caribbean and along the west coast, the OSS and the Navy in 1943 enter into a relationship with this organized crime empire that Lansky and Luciano have created. And in order because most of the labor unions along the coasts are controlled by the mafia. Labor racketeering is one of the big four franchises of organized crime at this time. And they virtually control all the maritime and longshoremen unions all along the coasts, along the country.
And those were Genovese family, weren't they?
Pardon me?
Those were Genovese family ports, correct?
Yeah, there were the 5 crime families in New York City, and they made sure that everybody had a piece. It was actually Albert Anastasia was the big longshoreman boss at that time, but everybody, it was in New Jersey as well. It's just everywhere, DC, wherever. And so they make this enter into a devil's pact with the underground, and they give them OSS agents and Navy agents get union passes and start, are actually infiltrated into the unions so that they can organize the unions to watch for German spies and things like that. And they actually become blood brothers with the national security state in late 1942 and 1943. And in return for helping the government, they get a free pass. There's like 1 million murders in this period of time that one investigated. Anybody who's ratting out the mafia at this time, like there was one guy, Abe Rellis, the canary, who couldn't fly, who fell out of a hotel room window on the 6th floor with 6 New York cops had fallen asleep simultaneously while watching him, sort of like Jeffrey Epstein just the other day. For some reason, everybody falls asleep at the same time, the entire guard. Well, nothing has changed in that respect. That the security forces can still reach into the Bureau of Prisons or into any local law enforcement agency, the New York Police Department, the Cleveland Police Department, and get them to do their bidding. They just flash a card and say this is national security, and any investigation is shut down, and any informant that has to be offed gets offed. The national security agencies had that kind of control over local law enforcement, and it became like this brotherhood in World War II as a result of this, deal with the devil that they made. And at the same time, when they're going to invade Italy, they need contacts in Italy, so that when the army lands at Anzio or wherever in Sicily to begin with, they have people there that can show them where to go, and they create those contacts in Sicily through the Mangano family and a guy named Joe Adonis provide like 100 contacts for the Navy and the OSS in Sicily. And when after the OSS and the Navy and the Army invade Sicily, most of the political positions that are handed out there, and then later in Italy, are handed to mafioso, because they're not only are they're promised, a bright future. All they have to do is fight communism. And the mafia starts on behalf of the OSS and the Navy and the Army in exchange for helping with the invasion. They get political positions, and now they start organizing forces to fight communism. And this happens not only in Italy, which is where James Angleton is located. Okay, James Angleton's the head of counterintelligence in Italy for the OSS, which means he's the guy that's overseeing this whole operation with the underworld. And he's actually making trips back and forth to the United States, where he's meeting with mafia officials here and working with their contacts in Italy to arrange this whole thing, which is the new war against anti-communism, which really starts burgeoning after the fascists are defeated in World War II. And now the mafia becomes a huge ally for the United States overseas in the war against communism. In France, CIA agents work with anti-communist unions in Marseille to get the communists out of Marseille. And in exchange, they're allowed to ship heroin to the United States. And it's the same for the mafia in Sicily. In exchange for helping in the war against communism in Italy, they're given free passage. And it's the same thing in the Far East. As the United States and the CIA start battling communist China, the Kuomintang, which is now relocated to Taiwan, is given free passage. They have to support themselves somehow, and they're fighting forces that ring southern China, and the primary way of doing this is through drug trafficking. And the CIA then underwrites the whole thing.
So it kind of seems like over a period of 20 or 30 years, it goes from kind of tolerating the importing of drugs to becoming an active player in overseeing the drug operations. At what point did that really become almost unspoken policy for the United States? Was there one particular moment or person who enacted that as modus operandi for the American government?
Well, propaganda was always important. Okay, you can't conduct these kind of covert operations of supporting international drug traffickers without having a cover story or without having the power to cover it up. Okay, like if it comes down to it, you have to kill a guy like Jeffrey Epstein. Well, who has the power to do that and cover it up? Well, the Department of Justice has that power. So right away from the very beginning, the CIA is working with the Department of Justice, the Treasury Department, the Department of State, and these domestic agencies are providing the necessary cover for the CIA to do these covert operations that involve support of international drug traffickers, and that stays in place. That is a policy, of providing cover for them up until the Vietnam War. And when the Vietnam War starts, and reporters start finding out that the CIA has an army in Laos, and that the CIA is running heroin labs and sending the heroin into Vietnam in order to convince South Vietnamese generals to work for them, and that the heroin is going. They wouldn't have fought the war if they weren't being allowed to traffic in narcotics and make a lot of money on the side. The South Vietnamese generals and politicians, when reporters start discovering that the CIA is running the entire Southeast Asia drug operation out of Laos and Thailand and Burma, largely with Kuomintang troops, with the help of the Thais. Thailand, they have to do something now that's different. They have to actually provide a better way. Al McCoy wrote a book, this guy in 1972, called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, and that just blows the lid off it. Okay, so up until Vietnam War, up until 1967 and 68, the Bureau of Narcotics under Harry Anslinger only had at the most 16 agents overseas. So the way that they were covering for the CIA was just not having any investigators over. Okay, they were not investigating the problem. And when they sent guys overseas, in 1951 they had 4 guys. In 1960 they had like 8 or 10 or 12. Half the time those guys were CIA officers. operating undercover of the Bureau of Narcotics. So that's how they were able to keep the lid on it. The CIA starts actually infiltrating the Bureau of Narcotics after World War II, assigning, giving credentials, DEA, well, at the time that's Bureau of Narcotic Credential, to its officers, and then saying you're running narcotic investigations in Thailand or in Japan or wherever. So these guys are actually facilitating this whole structure, the whole CIA narcotic, importation and distribution business for its allies. But like I said, by the Vietnam War, this becomes impossible to do anymore. So they dissolve the Bureau of Narcotics. They take it out of the Treasury Department, and in 1968 they reorganize it in the Department of Justice, and they start expanding it. And it goes from having 16 agents overseas in 1967 to by 1969 they have like 500 operating overseas. And it's now under the Department of Justice. And starting in 1968, the CIA starts infiltrating all the branches of the new organization that's created called the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. They take over its intelligence division. They create an intelligence division for the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and they staff it entirely with CIA officers who now have the security clearances to read CIA memos. And they do this, and they start sending agents around the world, and they infiltrate this Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. They infiltrate its internal affairs division. They staff it with CIA agents so that they can investigate any kind of problems that are going on, any kind of corruption issues, and they can cover it up before it becomes a problem. That's the first, up until 1968, that's covered in my book, Strength of the Wolf. Starting from 1968, when the CIA starts infiltrating the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and they put like 120 officers in it within 2 or 3 years. I mean, just absolutely take over all its foreign operations and take, the management part of it, and take over the management of its internal security division, so that nobody can make a fuss about what the intelligence and operations people are doing. That's why in my book, The Strength of the Pack, from 1968 up until around 2000 is when that book stops. And that book, Strength of the Pack, describes in painstaking detail exactly who these CIA guys are that are infiltrated into the BNDD and later on the DEA, and how they actually take over the DEA and turn it into an adjunct overseas of the CIA, so that it's completely foolproof. And so they continue to keep trying to suppress any news or information becoming public about the U.S. government's support for allies that are involved in narcotic trafficking. They continue to keep suppressing that on an official level, although by the time Vietnam War is done, books are being written about it, movies are being made about it. Everybody in the world knows it's happening. It's just like a Trump lie. Everybody knows it's not true, but what the hell can you do about it? He's the president, and he's the one that makes the rules. And it's the same thing now. Even though everybody knows it's happening, there's nothing anybody can do about it, because only the people within the government and the national security state and the federal law enforcement have any control over actually the information that gets revealed officially, or how it's going to be handled, on an official basis. Does that all sum it up in a way?
Yes, absolutely. So as you move into the late 60s and 70s, you start to see the rise of people like Pablo Escobar, whose son said that he was a CIA agent the whole time. What was the relationship between the CIA and Escobar in that time?
I don't know that he was a CIA agent all that time, okay? But I do know that the CIA has a policy in South America, starting in Mexico, going down through the Caribbean into South America, of destabilizing all those countries as part of, the Monroe Doctrine, which is starting in the beginning of American history, after the Revolution. Right away, the United States always had ambitions of annexing every country south of the border, and controlling them. And that one way, the primary way of doing that, of keeping all nations like Colombia, Peru, Chile, all the Central American nations, and Mexico, is to destabilize them by the covert assistance of criminal organizations in those countries, so that their governments can never really get a control of their internal affairs. Okay, and at the same time, that the CIA is dealing with criminal organizations in every country south of the border, and making sure that they have guns and money, and they keeping them in business to destabilize central governments. They're also working with the central governments in these countries, providing them with technical aid, police assistance in the hunt for communists, to keep Central America from going, South America from ever going communist, where it's always a struggle, because they're such poor nations by and large, that there's really a lot of people struggling for nationalist rights and equal rights and economic rights, and that all political and social movements. So the CIA, as the covert operations branch and the criminal, what I call it, the organized crime branch of the United States, keeps all of the countries south of the border destabilized by financing and giving a free rein to guys like Pablo Escobar. Okay, and it's the same thing here. It turns out to be the same thing here. We know that the cocaine pours into Miami, pours into every state in the union, but it gives law enforcement, the DEA, something to fight against here. It increases police powers here. It gives the central government in the United States, through the war on drug, increased police powers all the time. Meanwhile, the drugs are going to people that nobody cares about. They're not important people. And if they're a Hollywood guy, then they just hire a team of lawyers and they get off. So anybody who's really important never gets scarfed up in the war on drugs. And you never see it. Anybody important getting scarfed up. It's always just focusing down on the lower classes and keeping them in prison. And so it's killing two birds with one stone. You keep by facilitating the operations of guys like Pablo Escobar, giving them free rein, you destabilize Colombia and the countries that are producing these kind of people, and at the same time you're providing their military forces and their police forces with lots of technical aid and aiming them against communists, and then protecting the national security interests of the United States, and you're giving law enforcement in the United States increased powers to prevent, which spill over and affect everything all the time. Narcotic investigations scarf up lots of other criminals. You were in the police, if you're a narcotic guy and you're doing a vice squad investigation, you're not just going to find out about narcotics. You're going to find out about bank robbery. You're going to find out about prostitution. The drugs and prostitution go hand in hand. All the vices. You're going to find out about money laundering. You're going to find out about corrupt officials here in the United States. So it really gives the police, the federal police, through the DEA, tons of power that goes beyond, and tons of influence that goes beyond merely catching a guy with a bag of cocaine. Now all of a sudden you have intelligence on people across the board for any kind of crime that they're doing. And all of the, and by the year 2000, the CIA had its own counter narcotics center, which was working and included DEA agents. So all this information, all this intelligence about people in the United States who are drug traffickers or involved with drug traffickers in any way, politically or socially, all those names get put into the computer, are now available to the CIA. So the CIA now has in its computer political intelligence on Americans through its association with the DEA.
So in the CIA, there's a couple guys that I just love to hate, and one of them is Ted Shackley. Ted Shackley was connected to Reinhard Gehlen and the Gehlen organization before he took over the JM Wave station in Miami. What was Shackley's role in the narcotics trade? And was he connected to the South American cocaine trade through the Gehlen organization?
Sure. Shackley is the epitome or the personification of how a CIA officer gets involved in drug trafficking. And initially, when he comes back from Germany, and I don't have any knowledge of whether or not he was involved in drug trafficking while he was over in Germany and Europe, but certainly when he goes back to the United States, it's either 1960 or 61, one of his first jobs is working with a mafioso guy named Johnny Roselli. And one of the things that they do, this is very early, like I can't remember if it's late 60 or early 61, is they give poison pills that are developed by the CIA through its MK Ultra program to a trafficker, the biggest drug trafficker in the United States at the time, a guy named Santo Trafficante, who runs all the rackets. He actually was bringing, through 1950s, the Trafficante family with French Corsicans owned Cuba. And they would bring, the Trafficante family would bring drugs into Florida, Tampa, Miami, and they would have an auction. The rest of the mafia families would come down to Florida, and the Trafficante family would auction off all the, huge quantities. And because they have this national organization, organized crime, they would very calmly divvy it up, so each city would have its own fair share of the Trafficante haul bringing in. Well, after Castro takes over Cuba and the CIA decides to kill Castro, they hire Trafficante to do the job initially. And the CIA officer who works with him is Ted Shackley. Okay, so Shackley knows from the very beginning that you got to work with drug traffickers against communists, especially in Cuba. And that's what he does for the next 5 years. He runs what's called the JM Wave station, which is in Florida, and which is waging war against Castro and the Cubans, and all the Cubans, exiled Cubans, who have spread across, who go to work for the CIA and Shackley, and are sent to Panama, are sent to Colombia to spy on communists in those countries. And one of the ways that they spy on communists for Ted Shackley and the CIA throughout Central America and into South America is by getting involved with drug trafficking in those countries. Okay? And they start actually creating drug networks. The CIA creates all these Cuban, with its Cuban assets, all this huge drug network from, they're in Mexico, they're in Central America, they're throughout South America, they're working with the French Corsicans, and they're bringing in drugs all throughout that part of the country. Into Florida Miami becomes like the drug haven of the world. Okay, that's all thanks to Shackley and his bosses in the CIA. It's not just him. The whole apparatus is set up, and they're basically using these anti-Castro Cubans as their cadres to set up this huge drug trafficking network throughout the region. Okay, then in 1966, lo and behold, Shackley goes to Laos, and that's where he becomes station chief. And he's station chief in Laos from 1966 to 1968. And from 66 to 68, he's basically running Golden Triangle Industries. All the drugs that are being produced in Laos and distributed and coming in from Burma and going to Bangkok and into South Vietnam. By coincidence, Trafficking makes a visit to Saigon in 1968 and starts bringing in drugs from Laos into Miami. So through Shackley, and again, not just Shackley, but all his bosses and all his colleagues in all these different countries. They're all in it together. We know about Shackley, but they're all in it together, and they're all supporting all the generals in Laos, all the generals in Thailand, all the generals in South Vietnam that are on their payroll. And letting these guys so facilitate the importation of those drugs into the United States by giving them, again, mafia connections like Trafficani, who's a protected person because of his involvement with the CIA trying to kill Castro. This is a guy who's the biggest drug importer into the United States, and he never gets convicted of anything. Same for Meyer Lansky. These guys never serve a day in jail because they're what they're called $1 million men. They work for the CIA, so nobody can touch them. And there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of these people spread out around the world today.
When you talk about the anti-Castro Cubans and the relationship that the CIA had with the mafia back then, we've talked about the Kennedy assassination before, and there's a big overlap there because a lot of these guys who are the anti-Castro Cubans were recruited as soon as they stepped off the boat by the CIA. But then you have people like Sergio Arcacha Smith, who were also working as a bagman for Marcelo. I'm not going to get into the Kennedy assassination, but I'm convinced, almost 99%, that Ted Shackley was in Dealey Plaza that day and got detained under the name Larry Florer. So yeah, the overlap there is pretty amazing, and it really kind of opened my eyes to the relationships between the government and these underworld organizations.
Sure, and the people that are investigating in the United States, the anti-Castro Cubans, okay, and there are people investigating them, customs people, narcotic bureau people. These are the people in the United States that the CIA recruits. That's how they infiltrate customs. That's how they infiltrate the narcotics bureau. That's how they infiltrate the Dade County Police Department. The CIA actually goes into domestic law enforcement organizations, from the federal down to the local, and they say, do not bother this guy, do not bother that guy. And this is how they're able to run paramilitary training camps in Louisiana that are training Cubans to go back and invade Cuba. This is how they're able to do these sorts of things that violate every statute and law in the United States against doing these sorts of things, is because it's for national security in the anti-communist jihad.
Right, and a lot of people don't realize that was another kind of nexus point for the CIA and the mafia, because you had at least 20 or 30 mafia guys that I've identified who were actively involved in the anti-Castro plots, the Operation Mongoose.
Sure, and well beyond that, into all sorts of things you don't even know about. Okay. I mean, this happens in Spain. It happens in England. It happens everywhere where there's drug connections. Cubans go to Spain. Anti-Castro Cubans go to Spain. They start networks there, and in Portugal, they work with French Corsicans. So all sorts of, they're going all around the world. When Shackley goes to Laos, he brings with him a guy named Dave Morales. This very famous anti-Castro. Well, I don't know that I don't think Morales was a Cuban, but he brings other Cubans with him, like a guy named Felix Rodriguez, and these people, become integral to CIA operations around the world in many other aspects, and as do other criminals. It's not just the well-known names that you know.
So we have a relationship between the underworld and the federal government going back to the 1930s. And here we are in the 1960s and 70s, and it seems to have solidified into a more structured trafficking organization. Now, when we fast forward to the 1990s and you have like the Los Angeles crack problem with Freeway Ricky Ross, he said that he dealt with CIA agents in the 90s. Now, the question is, has that ever ended, or does it persist to this very day? Because, I think it's more than coincidence that in 2001, the opium production out of Afghanistan dropped to record low levels, and that's where we seem to go to war. So tell us about the modern day involvement of the government with drug trafficking.
Well, I know nothing has changed, okay? And in Afghanistan, of course, is the case study. As you say, when the Taliban took over, they outlawed opium production in Afghanistan. And then the next year, the CIA takes over in 2001, okay? The only way that they could get to create this Northern Alliance to fight the Taliban was to hire the drug trafficking warlords. So the CIA hired, as its mercenary army in Afghanistan, the major drug trafficking warlords there, who most of their connections were to Russia. And this is largely where they're dealing drugs, is to the Russian underworld. But by that point, the Soviet Union has collapsed. And a lot of the major drug traffickers in Russia at the time, who were receiving a lot of the heroin and opium from Afghanistan, are actually organized crime characters who are on the CIA payroll. But now they're people that you really don't know. If you study, a couple of congressional committees right now are doing investigations into Russian drug money laundering, and it's all connected to Donald Trump's taxes. Why they're trying to get Donald Trump's taxes, because a lot of these really impressive oligarchs in Russia who rose to power through the drug trade and through the criminal underworld all have CIA connections, which is why in the Mueller report you'll never see any reference to the CIA. It's like the CIA doesn't exist when it comes to an official report like the Mueller report. It is not mentioned once. And yet who's doing all the primary investigations on Russia? Well, the CIA is. And why are these investigations being covered up? Well, for the same reason TACA was covered up in 1934 to 36, the same reason that the Kuomintang was covered up, up until it went out of business, in the mid 1970s, that the criminals in Russia that are dealing narcotics are on the CIA payroll, and the CIA uses their influence to destabilize Russia. And one of the way it does it is by helping them to launder their drug money, which is why a guy like Donald Trump, when he magically needs $100 million, poof, the Deutsche Bank has $100 million to give him, so he can buy a country club somewhere, and let's say in Scotland or something like that. And this is how the process works nowadays, largely through the CIA being able to organize through it the bankers and the armed traffickers that are on its payroll these huge narcotic transactions. And at the same time, the president of Afghanistan, okay, his brother lived in Baltimore and was known by the DEA to be one of the largest drug traffickers in the United States. And so it was almost, nobody can prove it because nobody can do an investigation into it. But there's actually absolutely no doubt since the United States invaded Afghanistan, the drugs have been pouring into the United States from Afghanistan, not just into Russia and elsewhere around the world, but directly into the United States through the refugee community, Afghan community here in the United States, which just like it's mafia associates anywhere, They're $1 million men who are protected, and they have connections then to the American mafia, who then can distribute the drugs through their age-old distribution networks here in the United States, which the DEA carefully monitors, but is always, for some reason, incapable of disrupting on any permanent basis. Okay, the internet distribution networks are well mapped out. They're completely known, and yet they stay in place. And you have to ask why. Well, it's because just like with Ricky Ross, the coke goes to poor people. The heroin goes to Black communities. It goes to poor people. It keeps them disenfranchised. It's really just an extension of the plantation mentality. You can visit any kind of cruelty upon these people. They have no rights. They're disenfranchised. And that's the state of existence that this lower class, criminal class, has been kept in the United States, especially since 2000, when, again, the drug trafficking is not, it's connected to the Bureau of Prisons. It's connected to the industry of private prison industry that has burgeoned in the United States. People are making fortunes off drug enforcement here in the United States, not through the judicial system. I'm not saying that very well, but I think everybody understands what I'm saying. There's money to be made by incarcerating these people, just like there's money to be made by incarcerating migrants who are crossing the southern border right now. The same sort of thing. You got to maintain these industries, really punitive law enforcement industries in the United States, by creating the crime which feeds these industries.
So I just have a couple questions before we wrap up. First off, how high up the chain of the federal government does awareness of all this go? Do presidents know this? Do Congress people know this? And are they complicit? And also, is there any country in the world that isn't involved in illegal activities, particularly drug trafficking?
Everybody who's important knows it in the United States. And just like, a couple of years ago, I was talking with the janitor at this health club I go to. And his father was a retired narcotic detective in Springfield, which is right in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is right next to where I live in Longmeadow. And we're talking, and we go out and shoot pool. And one day he says, my father told me that the Springfield Police Department lets the mafia bring the drugs into Springfield and then watches them distribute it to the Puerto Ricans and the Blacks so they can make their cases. So it's not just the most important people in the United States who understand this. It's everybody in every town across the country understands it. And everybody understands what's going on. If they wanted to stop the importation and distribution of drugs, they could. They know who all the players are. The FBI knows, but the FBI uses these drug traffickers to report, again, on political activities within the city of Springfield. The mayor, of Springfield, I'm not saying this is true, but I'm using it as a metaphor, his brother's in the mafia, so they can get and have political influence over the mayor because they know his brother is dealing drugs. So as long as dealing drugs can be used for ancillary purposes to create fortunes for people in the law enforcement industry, selling body armor, selling Glocks, selling police equipment. You can't make money outfitting the police departments with all the paramilitary equipment it needs if suddenly there's no crime. So from the very beginning, in fact, one of the first chapters in my book, Strength of the Wolf, is called Creating a Crime. The DEA, and really back when it was the Bureau of Narcotics, the thing that they are taught to do is to create a crime. Okay, because drug trafficking basically takes place in an underground with consenting adults, just like gambling is consenting adults. It's different with prostitution, but we still see that going on because just like, again, the Epstein case, it provides the intelligence agencies with blackmail fodder on political and industrial people in the United States. So they allow prostitution and sex trafficking happening in the United States because the most senior levels of law enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security now and the FBI can use this to suppress people politically and to get them to do their bidding politically. And this information gets shared with the CIA and the military, and that's why you have a $1 trillion Pentagon budget every year instead of money going to the infrastructure, instead of having money going to building roads and providing for medical care for everybody, instead of having a socially cohesive country where people do well, you have all this money spent on law enforcement and the military, and the people who are creating the problem are the law enforcement people themselves. They are creating the crimes, the drug trafficking crimes, the sex trafficking crimes, because it's what keeps the 1% owning 90% of the money, and the 90% owning none of it, because this it's all set up through this very elaborate system of control of crime in the United States. That's how it works. And until you start getting that mindset out of our rulers, nothing will ever change. It's how inequality is maintained in the United States, just like it was on the plantations when slavery was, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing has changed in that way. The powerful use organized crime to suppress people who aren't powerful. And all the federal law enforcement agencies have as that unspoken purpose, maintaining that balance of power, because they report not to the guy on the street. They report to their congressmen and their senators and the executive department branch of the government, which in turn work for industry, and the billionaires. And this is the way our society is structured. And if you study how drug law enforcement has evolved, it becomes crystal clear, which is why everybody should read my books.
Doug, I really appreciate your time. This has been an amazing conversation, and I think the work that you've done throughout your career is, you wrote history for the most part. I really appreciate your being on the show, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Doug.